What happens when an undercover owner defends a veteran and his service dog, only to lose his job, and then watch as the entire community rallies behind him in ways he never expected? Let's dive in to see. The man who owned the small diner on Maple Street wasn't your typical boss. His name was Calvin Harker, and he ran Harker's Grill with quiet determination that made him well-liked by most people in town. But what no one knew was that Calvin had been working undercover at his own restaurant for weeks now. He didn't tell anyone, not even his best friend, Leo, who managed the place during lunch hours. Calvin wanted answers. Complaints about rude staff behavior had been piling up lately, but every time he tried to address them directly, employees would put on their best smiles and act like nothing was wrong. So, late last month, Calvin decided to take matters into his own hands. He shaved off his trademark beard, traded his usual flannel shirts for plain t-shirts, and started visiting his own diner as just another customer. It wasn't easy pretending not to care about how things were run, but he figured it was worth it if he could fix the problems from the inside out. That morning, everything seemed normal until a tall figure walked through the door. The man wore faded jeans and a jacket that looked like it had seen better days. His face carried deep lines, etched there by years of hard work and maybe some battles too. At first glance, you might think he was just tired, but something about his posture told you otherwise. He carried himself with a kind of strength that came only from knowing exactly who he was. Beside him stood a golden retriever named Max, calm and steady, tethered to a harness marked service dog. Calvin noticed immediately because Max wasn't wearing any tags or identification badges. As soon as they sat down, one of the servers approached the table. His voice carried a sharp edge. "Sir," he said, leaning forward slightly, "we don't allow pets inside." The man's eyes flickered upward, meeting his with a calmness that bordered on exhaustion. "This isn't a pet," he replied softly. "He's my service dog." "I'm sorry," the server snapped back, crossing his arms. "We can't verify that without proper paperwork." Calvin felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't right. Service animals weren't supposed to be questioned this way. Still, he kept his mouth shut, watching closely to see how things played out. After all, part of being undercover meant staying invisible. But then the man spoke again, his tone tinged with sadness. "Paperwork got lost during my last move. I've served this country for over 20 years. You think I'd lie about needing help?" The server hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. That's when Calvin stepped in. Rising from his seat, he walked over to the table, his steps deliberate. "Excuse me," he said firmly, addressing the server. "If this man says his dog helps him, we believe him. Bring him a menu." His expression darkened. "But Mr. Harker, do I need to remind you about our policy?" Calvin cut him off, his voice low but firm. "We serve everyone here, regardless of circumstances. Now go do your job." For a moment, the room fell silent. Then the server stormed away, muttering under his breath. The man nodded gratefully toward Calvin. "Thank you," he murmured. "Not many people understand." "No problem," Calvin replied, forcing a smile before heading back to his seat. But as soon as the words left his lips, he realized he'd made a mistake. Within minutes, the server returned, this time carrying a note from Leo. Calvin opened it reluctantly, scanning its contents. "You're fired," it read. His stomach dropped. Fired? For standing up for someone in need? Before he could process what happened, Leo appeared beside him. "You heard me," Leo growled. "You jeopardized the business today. We can't afford bad publicity." Calvin stared at him, disbelief washing over him. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. That guy needed help. And now we have a potential lawsuit on our hands," Leo shot back. "Get out." Shaken, Calvin gathered his things and left without another word. Outside, the air felt colder than usual, biting against his skin. He glanced across the street where the man still sat with Max, sipping coffee quietly. Guilt gnawed at Calvin's chest. Had he done the right thing? Or had he thrown away everything for nothing? As the clock struck noon, Calvin found himself wandering aimlessly through town, replaying the scene in his mind. Then, suddenly, his phone buzzed. A text message popped up from an unknown number. "Meet me at your diner in 1 hour. Important." Confused, Calvin checked the time. 1 hour? What could possibly happen next? When Calvin returned to Harker's Grill an hour later, the parking lot was packed with cars. Curiosity outweighed caution as Calvin approached the building, stepping inside cautiously. To his surprise, the entire staff stood frozen near the counter, staring wide-eyed at the strangers filling the room. It was the man from earlier, the one with Max, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood several other men, all dressed casually, but carrying themselves with the same quiet confidence. Some wore hats with military insignias. Others carried leather jackets with patches sewn onto the sleeves. Among them was a tall figure, broader and more imposing, dressed in a crisp uniform bearing insignias that screamed authority. The newcomer locked eyes with Calvin, his gaze piercing yet respectful. "Mr. Harker," the man began, extending a hand. "I'm Commander Grayson. This man," he gestured toward the vet, "is Corporal Jake Miller. He told me what happened here today." Calvin blinked, struggling to find words. I didn't do anything special, just stood up for what's right." Commander Grayson nodded solemnly. "Sometimes doing what's right costs us dearly, but sometimes it also brings attention to those who deserve recognition." He paused, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "Jake mentioned your actions earlier. Turns out he knows quite a bit about you already." "What do you mean?" Calvin asked, frowning. Grayson unfolded the paper, revealing a certificate dated several years ago. "You were awarded the Medal of Honor for bravery in combat. Am I correct?" Stunned, Calvin took the document, running his fingers over the familiar seal. How did Jake know? And why hadn't anyone ever brought it up before? Jake stepped forward then, his voice thick with emotion. "Calvin, I saw your name on a plaque at the local VFW hall. When you helped me today, I knew I had to connect the dots. You saved lives once. Today, you saved mine." A lump formed in Calvin's throat. "I didn't save anything. I just did what anyone else would have done." "Maybe so," Grayson interjected, "but actions speak louder than intentions. Because of you, Jake will receive new training for Max, courtesy of the Marines. And because of Jake, I learned about a true hero hiding in plain sight." Before Calvin could respond, Grayson turned to Leo, who stood pale-faced nearby. "Your employee has integrity. If I were you, I'd reconsider letting him go." Leo swallowed hard. "Sir, I'll reinstate him immediately." As the commander left, leaving behind a stunned silence, Calvin felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Life rarely handed second chances, but today it had. Maybe, just maybe, standing up for others wasn't such a bad idea after all. Later that evening, as Calvin locked up the diner, he thought about the day's events. Sometimes losing everything gave you the chance to gain something far greater, a reminder of who you truly are. And perhaps, in helping others, we discover parts of ourselves we never knew existed. "Life doesn't always reward kindness," Calvin whispered to himself, glancing at the stars above. "But when it does, hold on to it tightly." And with that, he walked home, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. That's the story, friends. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a pleasure sharing it with you all. Don't forget to comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It's always fun to see the global reach of these stories. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button for more amazing stories, tips, and tricks. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. If you'd like to show some extra love, tap the 3 dots near the share button and send a super thanks.